My name is Corporal Dmitry Alexeyevich Vashenko, of the 2nd Company, 14th Siberian Rifle Regiment, stationed out of Tobolsk. I am 31 years of age. I give this account under oath before the Regimental Inquest Board convened at Tobolsk Garrison on the 14th of February, 1915, in the matter of the death of Lieutenant Arkady Semyonovich Polubin and the non-completion of the winter supply requisition to the Yenisei Valley settlements. I will be as precise as the record demands. I will not omit the parts that reflect poorly on my own conduct, because this board has the authority to compel testimony, and because I believe, having thought about it for 6 weeks, that an incomplete account would be more dangerous than a complete one. I want to say plainly, before anything else, that I was not a man given to folklore. I grew up in Ekaterinburg. I had 4 years of schooling. I had served 22 months in the army before this posting, including 14 months at the forward supply depots near Galicia, where I saw men die from rifle fire and field infection and cold, and I understood those deaths. What I will describe here I did not understand, and I still do not, but I will describe it exactly as it occurred, and leave the interpretation to this board. I want to note for the record that the requisition ledger from this detail, document series R7-14 in the regimental supply files, contains annotations in the margins beginning at the entry for January the 8th, 1915. Those annotations are in Sergeant Fyodor Grigorievich Kalnin's handwriting for the first portion, and in my own for the latter portion. I have identified both hands for the inquest clerk. That ledger is the document that prompted this inquest, and I will account for every entry in it before I am done. The detail was assembled on the 3rd of January. 6 men, Lieutenant Polubin commanding, Sergeant Kalnin, myself, and 3 privates, Shevchuk, Borodin, and a young man named Matveyev, who had only been with the regiment 11 weeks. Our orders were standard winter rotation. We were to travel by sled northeast, along the Yenisei tributary road, approximately 140 kilometers, reach the settlement called Ustyalov, confirm population numbers and grain stores, collect the imperial requisition of preserved foodstuffs that the settlement owed to the regimental depot, and return by the 22nd of January. A 2.5-week posting, nothing unusual for winter supply work in the valley districts. We had done similar rotations twice the previous winter without incident. We reached Ustyalov on the morning of January the 8th. I should say what I noticed first, because it is relevant to everything that follows, and the board should understand that the first sign that something was wrong was not a sound, and it was not a sight, it was a smell. I have tried in the weeks since to describe it accurately. I am going to try again here because the record should have it precisely. Winter smell in the Siberian settlements is a specific thing. Wood smoke, animal dung, hay, rendered tallow from the lamps, the flat metallic cold of the air itself. You learn it after 2 winters in the district, and it becomes almost pleasant, because it means shelter and warmth. What came at us as we drove the sleds into the village boundary was something underneath all of that. Something sweet, but not pleasantly sweet. Overripe. The way a wound smells when it has been closed over infection rather than cleaned. And beneath the sweetness, something copper, like wet iron, like blood that has been pooled rather than shed. It was faint. It was the kind of smell that makes a man lift his head and look around before he can name what is bothering him. Shevchuk wrinkled his nose and said the village must have had livestock die recently. I did not say anything. I filed it away. The settlement was smaller than our maps suggested. Perhaps 40 souls in 14 structures, clustered in the standard valley pattern, main track running east to west, homes set back from it on both sides, a communal barn at the eastern end, a well at the center, and at the western end, the headman's house, slightly larger than the rest, with a small attached structure that served as both storage and the local feldherr's treatment room. The village looked quiet in the way that Siberian settlements look quiet in January, which is to say nearly lifeless, most people indoors, smoke from every chimney, the tracks of boots and sled runners packed hard in the snow of the main track. But there were almost no fresh tracks. I noticed this on the second pass through the main track, after we had halted the sleds and Lieutenant Polubin had gone to the headman's house. The packed snow was old. 3, perhaps 4 days without anyone walking it in any number. That was unusual. Even in deepest winter, a village of 40 moves through its own common ground every day. Firewood, water from the well, children sent on errands. The track should have shown the business of daily life. Instead, it showed us almost nothing, and what tracks existed were the tracks of 1 or 2 people moving quickly, directly, without the aimless overlapping of ordinary village activity. I did not report this observation to Lieutenant Polubin immediately. I mention it now because I believe my failure to report it promptly, while not the cause of what followed, contributed to the delay in our understanding of what we had arrived into. Lieutenant Polubin returned from the headman's house and assembled us near the sleds. He was a 34-year-old man from Petersburg, officer class, educated at a military academy, the kind of officer who understood logistics and order and had a genuine capacity for administration, but who had a very particular relationship with the concept of superstition, which is to say he treated it as he would treat mud on his boots, as an unpleasant feature of the rural world that reflected poorly on the people who tracked it indoors. He was not a cruel man. I want to be clear about that because his death is a matter before this board, and I do not wish to speak ill of a man who cannot speak for himself. But he had a certainty about the shape of the world that made him incapable of hearing certain kinds of information. He told us that the headman, an old man named Grigory Osipovich Lavrov, had confirmed that the village grain stores were complete and the requisition would be met. He also told us that 11 villagers had died in the previous 11 days, and that the deaths were being attributed to a winter illness. He said this in the tone of a man who has received an administrative complication rather than alarming news. He said we would billet in the communal barn, 3 men per night on watch rotation, and we would begin the physical count of stores the following morning. Sergeant Kalnin asked how 11 people had died in 11 days from a winter illness without the settlement having requested medical assistance. Lieutenant Polubin said the roads were difficult and the villagers had a felger. Kalnin said nothing else. He wrote the 11 deaths in the margin of the requisition ledger. I watched him do it. He wrote it in very small letters, as if minimizing the size of the numbers could contain their significance. That entry is the first marginal annotation the board has examined. We were given access to the communal barn that evening, and we made our bivouac there. It was a solid structure, hay-smelling and cold, but not dangerously so, with space enough for our gear and the sleds. The village sent us a meal through a girl of perhaps 14, who set the pot outside the barn door and knocked without entering. I thought this was shyness, the usual rural wariness of soldiers. I understand now it was something else. I will describe what Kalnin found the following morning, because it is the first event that made the situation fully real to me, rather than merely strange. Kalnin woke early, as was his habit, and went to speak with the felger about the illness before the lieutenant was up. He came back within 20 minutes. He did not speak immediately when he came in. He sat down on his bedroll and unlaced and relaced his boot, which was a thing he did when he was working through something in his mind. Then he told me, quietly, without theater, that the 11 deaths had not been from illness in any form the felger could name. The felger, a middle-aged woman named Tarasova, who had served the district for 16 years, had shown Kalnin the bodies. There were 3 remaining in her treatment room, the most recent deaths, 2 men and a woman. She had not yet prepared them for burial, because the ground was frozen, and she was waiting on the men to dig, and she had needed to show someone. The injuries were identical on all 3. 2 small puncture wounds at the throat, close together, not jagged, not the tearing of an animal bite. Clean entry wounds, roughly 4 millimeters in diameter each, spaced approximately 3 centimeters apart. And in all 3 cases, the blood had settled entirely to the lowest surface of the body. Not dispersed, not coagulated in place as blood does in natural death. Settled. as if the body had been tilted or the blood had been drawn toward the bottom of it by something other than gravity working over time. Tarasova had practiced medicine in that district for 16 years, and she could not explain it. She had told the headman. The headman had told the village, and the village had gone very quiet. I noted this information. I examined my own reaction to it, which was the reaction of a man trained to process unpleasant field information without letting it interfere with function. I told myself that there was a medical explanation that Tarasova lacked the training to identify. I told myself this for approximately the next 48 hours, which is how long it took for events to make that position indefensible. The first full day in Ustyalov passed in official activity. We conducted the count of the grain stores with the headman's cooperation. Lavrov was a man of perhaps 70, broad-shouldered in the way of men who spent their whole lives in physical labor, with a white beard and hands that had been strong once and still showed it. He moved carefully, as if conserving something. He answered Lieutenant Polubin's questions about the requisition fully and without delay. He did not raise the deaths himself, and the lieutenant did not ask about them beyond the original briefing. I watched Lavrov's face when the lieutenant was occupied with the ledger, and I noticed that he was watching us with something I can only describe as assessment. Not suspicion, not hostility, assessment, as if he were trying to determine something about us that we had not yet told him. The smell was present throughout the village that day, stronger than it had been on arrival, not overwhelming, but persistent. It clung to the inside of the headman's house, which we passed through briefly for the document review. It was heavier near the floor. Kalnin noticed it too. He said nothing about it to the lieutenant, but he caught my eye when we stepped outside and shook his head slightly. The 11th death was confirmed that day. A man of about 50, found that morning by his wife at the edge of their yard, face down in the snow, the 2 wounds at his throat already frozen. He was the 11th consecutive night death. Tarasova had, by this point, annotated the pattern with a thoroughness that I think speaks well of her. Each death had occurred between the hours of midnight and 4 in the morning. Each body was found outside or just inside a structure, and in every case, the person had gone out alone for some reason that their family, in retrospect, could not fully account for. As if they had been called. I include this detail for the record. That night, the watch rotation was Kalnin from first watch to second, Shevchuk from second to third, and Borodin on the third watch until dawn. I slept through. Nothing happened that night. Or rather, nothing happened that we were prepared to recognize as something happening. Borodin reported in the morning that he had smelled, very strongly, the copper-sweet odor for perhaps 20 minutes around 3 in the morning, and that during that time the horses had been agitated, pulling at their tethering lines inside the barn and snorting without visible cause. And then the smell had faded, and the horses had settled. Borodin was a deliberate, not particularly imaginative man from the Ural region. He reported this the way he would report a weather change or an equipment issue, as a factual observation without assigned meaning. Lieutenant Polubin wrote it off as a fox or a carrion animal in the vicinity. He said this with the confidence of a man closing a question rather than answering it. On the second day, the headman came to speak with the lieutenant. I was present for this conversation, seated at the far end of the barn with the ledger. I will record what was said as accurately as I can. Lavrov said that he needed to speak to the officer about a matter regarding the welfare of the detail. He said it carefully, framing it as a military welfare concern rather than a personal request, and I thought then that he was a man who understood how to approach officers of the lieutenant's type. He said that there was something in the village, something that had been in the area for a very long time, and that there was an arrangement in place regarding it, an old arrangement, one his grandfather had made and his father had maintained, and that he himself had maintained for 23 years. He said the arrangement was anchored to the iron icon set beneath the threshold of his house, and that under no circumstances should that icon be disturbed or removed, because its placement was the physical condition of the arrangement, and if the condition was broken, the thing that was bound by the arrangement would not consider itself bound. Lieutenant Polubin asked what kind of arrangement and what kind of thing. Lavrov was quiet for a moment. Then he said the village had an agreement with what lived in the river valley. He did not use the word upir. He did not use any word at all. He said, in the precise translation I recorded in the ledger margin that evening, the one who has been here since before our grandfathers, who has always taken from us in winter, but only one, and only when the arrangement holds. The lieutenant's response was polite, but terminal. He thanked Lavrov for bringing the matter to his attention. He said the requisition would be completed by the following day. He said that the army did not recognize private ritual objects embedded in imperial property, and that if any such object existed under the headman's threshold, it would be examined and either passed or confiscated in accordance with regulations concerning contraband religious items, of which the army had a specific procedure. He said all of this very reasonably, in the tone of a man who has just solved a problem. Lavrov did not argue. He stood up. He looked at the lieutenant for a long moment. Then he said, "Then God protect you, because the arrangement will not." He left. The lieutenant returned to his paperwork. I sat with the ledger and I wrote Lavrov's words in the margin, in my own hand, in small letters alongside Kalnin's previous notation. That is the second marginal annotation the board has examined. I said nothing to the lieutenant then. I want to account for this omission. I believed at that moment that Lavrov was sincere and frightened and operating from a genuine conviction about his village's situation. I also believed that a man of my rank, making the argument that a peasant headman's folk arrangement with a river spirit ought to override a requisition order, was an argument that would end my military career and accomplish nothing regarding the order. So I said nothing. I am not proud of it, but I am reporting it accurately. The following morning, the 10th of January, Lieutenant Polubin sent Shevchuk and Matveyev to the headman's house with a shovel and a pry bar. They were instructed to locate and retrieve any object buried beneath or embedded within the main threshold of the structure. I watched them go from the barn door. I should note what the air was like that morning, because it is material to the record. The temperature was approximately -28°C, clear sky, no wind. The kind of Siberian winter morning that is intensely still, where sound carries enormous distances and your breath crystallizes before it leaves your mouth. The smell that had been present since our arrival was low that morning, barely detectable, a faint trace at the edge of perception, like something dried out and distant. I noticed it particularly because I had been paying attention to it since Kalnin's report, and its relative absence that morning seemed significant without my being able to say why. Shevchuk and Matveyev returned approximately an hour later carrying the icon. It was smaller than I expected from Lavrov's description. Roughly 30 centimeters long, 15 wide, iron cast rather than the usual gilt wood, depicting a figure I did not recognize. Not standard Orthodox iconography, older than that. The lines worn almost smooth from what looked like long handling, the iron dark and slightly rough with a patina of age. It had been wrapped in waxed cloth when buried, which had preserved it remarkably well. It was heavier than it looked. Shevchuk held it by the cloth and looked faintly unsettled, though he would not have admitted it. The lieutenant examined it briefly, declared it a folk idol of no religious consequence, and placed it in the requisition sled under a canvas sheet. I want to state clearly for the record that I handled the icon once during this period, when the lieutenant asked me to log it on the requisition form as a confiscated item. I held it for perhaps 30 seconds. It was cold in the way iron is always cold, nothing unusual about its temperature. But there was a smell that came off it very faintly, or that I believed came off it, the same copper-sweet odor, barely present, like an echo of it. I may have imagined this. I have considered that possibility. I note it because the board has asked for complete detail. That evening, the 12th death was recorded. And then, before dawn, the 13th. This is the point at which the pattern changed. 11 nights, 11 deaths, 1 per night. The icon was taken from the threshold at roughly 9 in the morning on the 10th of January. By the following dawn, 2 people were dead. A young woman of approximately 20, found at the rear of her family's home, and an old man from the far end of the settlement, found at the well, both displaying the identical wound pattern Tarasova had documented on the previous 11 bodies. Except in these 2 cases, Tarasova noted something different in addition to the wounds. The skin around the punctures on both bodies was warmer than the surrounding tissue. Not warm by any standard a living person would exhibit, but measurably warmer, as if something had been very recently present at that location on the skin. She told me this quietly, without the lieutenant in the room, and I wrote it in the ledger margin. The settlement changed that day. The near quiet that had prevailed during our first days there became something deeper. People did not come out at all. The girl who had brought us the meal did not come. Tarasova came to the barn herself, briefly, to tell us about the 2 bodies. And she was moving very fast for a woman of her age, and she did not look at the requisition sled when she passed it. The headman did not come. The village communicated its new condition to us through complete withdrawal. That night, the smell came in force. It began at approximately 11 in the evening. I was on first watch with Kalnin. The horses registered it before we did, the same agitation Borodin had reported, pulling at the lines, snorting, one of them giving a single short scream that is a sound I have not been able to unhear in the weeks since. Then I noticed it, not the faint background presence of the previous days. This was a full smell, dense and close, the sweetness so heavy it sat on the back of the throat like something physical, and underneath it, the copper note so sharp it was nearly a taste. It was coming from outside the eastern wall of the barn, not moving, not shifting, stationary, as if something had stopped there and was simply present. Kalnin was at the door. He had it cracked, not open, cracked, and he was looking out through the gap. I came to stand beside him. The night was clear, bright with the particular blue-white brightness of a Siberian winter night, with a full moon on snow. The kind of night where you can see detail at 100 meters. The main track was empty. The village was dark, except for the headman's house, which had a lamp burning in the window. Nothing was visible on the eastern side of the barn that I could identify as a source of the smell. But the snow was disturbed there. I could see it from the door gap, the area just beyond the eastern wall. Not the wide, irregular disturbance of an animal moving through. A specific, compressed disturbance, roughly the width of a human figure standing still. As if something had stood in one place long enough to press the surface snow slightly down without moving through it. Kalnin said very quietly, not a whisper, his normal speaking voice kept very low, "It's deciding." I asked him what he meant. He said he had spoken with one of the village men 2 days earlier, briefly, while the lieutenant was occupied with the grain count. The man had told him about the arrangement. Not everything Lavrov had told the lieutenant. More than that. He said the thing had been in the river valley as long as anyone's memory of the valley went. That it took. That was its nature. But the arrangement, the one Lavrov's grandfather had made, had put a structure around the taking. 1 life per winter month, offered, not taken by force. And in exchange the thing would not touch everyone. It would take its portion and keep to the margins. The icon in the threshold was the seal of that agreement, the physical expression of the contract, and as long as it remained undisturbed, the thing honored the terms. Without it, there were no terms. And a thing of that nature without terms, the man had said, does not exercise restraint. It does not need to. I have thought about what Kalnin told me that night many times since. I am reporting it in this testimony because it is the framework within which the subsequent events are most coherent. And coherence, even uncomfortable coherence, seems more useful to this inquest than a shorter account that leaves the sequence of events without explanation. We stayed at the door for approximately 40 minutes. The smell was constant during this time, not increasing, not decreasing, simply present at that intense level. The disturbance in the snow did not change. At around midnight, the smell began to thin. Slowly, the way a fog lifts, not suddenly. Within 20 minutes it was back to the background trace level that had been present since our arrival. The horses settled. The disturbance in the snow, when we examined it at first light, was still there, roughly 30 centimeters deep at the center point, as if something had stood without moving for a long time. No footprints approaching it, no footprints departing, just the standing place in the snow. I want the board to note this detail carefully, because it is one of the details I find most difficult to account for in conventional terms, and I have tried to account for it. There is no animal I know of that can cross open snow in deep winter and leave no track while standing and leaving a pressure impression. I report what we observed. I reported the full account of that night to Lieutenant Polubin the following morning. I did this in the presence of Kalnin because I wanted a witness to both what I said and how it was received. I described the smell, the horse's behavior, the disturbance in the snow, and Kalnin's information from the village man regarding the nature of the arrangement. I spoke plainly, and I tried not to editorialize. The lieutenant listened with the particular expression he used for information he had already decided was irrelevant before it finished being delivered. He said the smell was most likely a predator, possibly a bear disturbed from winter torpor, though he acknowledged the season made this unlikely. He said the disturbance in the snow could have been made before the snowfall settled overnight. He said the villagers' account of an arrangement was folk belief of the type common in isolated rural communities under stress, and that attributing deaths to a supernatural entity was a characteristic grief response in populations without access to proper medical reasoning. He said all of this, I note, within about 3 minutes, which did not suggest a great depth of consideration. Then he said we were completing the requisition that day and we were departing the following morning. He said this would put us ahead of schedule, which was preferable to falling behind. Kalnin said nothing during this briefing. After the lieutenant had gone back to his paperwork, Kalnin sat for a long time looking at the eastern wall of the barn. Then he took out the requisition ledger, opened it to the supply annotation pages, and began writing in the margin again. I watched him write. His handwriting, which was normally small and even, was by this point cramped in a way that was new. The letters pressed harder into the paper than his usual hand. I could read it from where I sat. He was cataloguing the wound measurements again, the settlement of blood, the temperature of the skin noted by Tarasova, writing it all down again, as if by recording it a second time he could make it more containable. That is the third marginal annotation the board has examined. On the 11th of January, 2 more died. We learned this when Tarasova came to the barn at approximately 7 in the morning and stood in the doorway and said, in a flat voice entirely stripped of emotional inflection, that we needed to give back what we had taken, or we needed to leave. She did not say this to any specific man. She said it to the room. Then she turned and went back toward her treatment room. The lieutenant was not present when she said this. He was at the headman's house, completing the final paperwork for the requisition. Kalnin, Shevchuk, Borodin, Matveyev, and I were in the barn. The 5 of us looked at each other across the hay and the sled equipment and the cold morning air. No one spoke for a moment. Then Matveyev, who was 19 years old and had been in the regiment 11 weeks, said, in a very quiet voice, that he wanted to go home. This was the first open statement of that sentiment. It broke something. Shevchuk said that he agreed, that they had what they came for, and there was no requirement to stay. Borodin said he needed to think about it. Kalnin said he wanted to wait for the lieutenant before any decision was made, because he was not going to lead a detachment abandonment, and he was not going to ask the men to choose between their orders and their lives without the officer present. I said I agreed with Kalnin. We tabled it. But the fact of the discussion existed now, and the fact of the discussion changed the atmosphere inside the barn in a way that is difficult to describe precisely, but that is important for the record to contain. There was a before and an after. Before Matveyev said it, we were a military detail with a strange and frightening situation. After he said it, we were 5 men who had acknowledged, collectively, that what was happening here was real enough to run from. That acknowledgement had a weight. The lieutenant returned mid-morning. He confirmed the requisition was complete. He confirmed departure for the following morning, the 12th, at first light. He said nothing about Tarasova's statement because none of us told him about it. I consider this another failure on my part. I am recording it as such. That afternoon, Kalnin asked to speak to the lieutenant privately. I do not know the full content of that conversation because I was not present. I know that it lasted approximately 20 minutes, and that Kalnin came out looking as if he had delivered a very difficult piece of news, and had been thanked for it by being told he was mistaken. He sat down and said nothing about the conversation for the rest of the afternoon. Later that evening, privately, he told me he had asked the lieutenant to return the icon to the threshold before we departed. He had framed it tactically, not as a supernatural matter but as a village relations matter, saying that confiscating the object had clearly elevated tensions in the settlement and that replacing it would smooth the relationship between the army and the population for future requisitions. He had not mentioned the arrangement directly. He had tried to work within the framework the lieutenant could hear. The lieutenant had said the icon had been logged on the requisition form as a confiscated item and could not be removed from the record without an inquest notation, which was more paperwork than the situation warranted. He had said this pleasantly. He had said it as if it were a simple administrative fact, which within his understanding of the world it was. That evening was when I made my decision. I want to describe it carefully because it reflects on my conduct and because the board should understand my reasoning. I considered taking the icon from the requisition sled during the night watch and replacing it in the threshold myself, without the lieutenant's knowledge. I considered this for several hours. I decided against it for two reasons that I am not proud of now. The first was that I did not know with certainty, at that point, that the icon was the operative factor. I told myself this was rational skepticism and not fear, but I am no longer certain that distinction was accurate. The second was that removing an item from a logged military requisition without authorization was a court-martial offense. A man can talk himself into many kinds of cowardice by framing it as adherence to proper procedure. I note this without excuse, so I did nothing. And that night, the 14th killed was a woman named, according to Tarasova's records, Yekaterina Nikolaevna, age 34, found at the edge of the village on the path toward the communal barn. She was 8 meters from the barn door. The wounds were the same. The blood had settled the same way. The skin at the punctures was, again, warmer than the surrounding tissue when Tarasova reached her. 8 meters from the barn door. The escalation that Kalnin and I had both been tracking in the abstract became, at that moment, entirely concrete. The thing was moving inward. The deaths had started at the perimeter of the village. They were moving toward the center, toward the soldiers. As Kalnin said to me, standing over the requisition ledger that morning, with the smell heavy in the air around us both, "It's working its way in." I told him I knew. He said, "We need to go to Polubin." I said I knew that too. We went to the lieutenant together. Kalnin presented the geographical progression of the deaths, the pattern charted on the settlement map he had sketched in the back of the supply ledger. 12 of the 14 deaths were clustered at the village periphery. The most recent 2 had been at the center. The most recent one had been at the edge of the barnyard. He laid the map on the table in front of the lieutenant and let him look at it without saying anything else. The lieutenant looked at it. He was quiet for a moment, the first genuine quiet I had seen from him regarding this situation. I thought for a moment that the map had done what Kalnin's words had not been able to, that it had translated the situation into a form the lieutenant's reasoning could engage with. He said that the pattern might indicate a predator with a territorial range that was contracting inward due to scarcity of prey at the margins. He said this slowly, as if working it out. It was not entirely unreasonable. It was also not adequate to the facts as we knew them. He said we would double the watch rotation for the final night and depart at first light as planned. Kalnin said, "Sir, with respect, the timing of the change in pattern corresponds precisely to the removal of the icon." The lieutenant said he was aware of Kalnin's opinion on the icon. Kalnin said, "If I am wrong, replacing it costs us nothing except a line item on the requisition form. If you are wrong, we are burying more men." The lieutenant said, "Sergeant, you are dismissed." That was the last substantive conversation between Kalnin and Lieutenant Polubin. I have included it because it is material to the inquest's understanding of how the subsequent events came to pass, and because I believe both men's positions should be represented accurately in the record. That afternoon, Shevchuk came to me. He was not a man I would have identified as the most perceptive member of the detail, but he had been watching the village carefully, and he had noticed something I had missed. He said that for the past 2 days, the surviving villagers had been clustering in the headman's house. Not all of them at once, but by evening, almost all of them were there, sleeping communally, the way people do during a siege. He said the headman's house was the only structure in the village with a deep cellar, and he had heard, through the walls when he passed, the sound of people praying in the specific, extended way that suggests fear rather than devotion. He said he thought the villagers knew exactly where the thing was going to go next, and they had pulled in toward the center as far as they could, away from the soldiers, away from the barn. I sat with this information, and then I made the decision I should have made 2 days earlier. I went to the requisition sled. I found the canvas sheet. I lifted the corner, and I put my hand on the wrapped icon. The smell came up from it strongly. Not from outside, not from the air of the barn, from the wrapping itself, or from beneath it. The copper-sweet rot that had been the constant background of the entire posting, rising from the oilcloth wrapping of the iron figure we had dug out of the headman's threshold. I remember stopping with my hand on it, and understanding, with the particular clarity that comes when a person has been arguing with themselves for days, and the argument is suddenly over, that the smell had been on the icon since the moment it was removed from the ground, that the smell was not native to the village, that the smell traveled with the object. I am recording this inference because it is not a minor detail. If accurate, it means the thing we were smelling throughout our posting was not ambient to the environment but was specifically associated with the icon. The board may draw its own conclusions from this. I did not take the icon from the sled. I want to be clear about that. I lifted my hand from the wrapping, replaced the canvas sheet, and walked back to the barn door. I told myself I would speak to the lieutenant one more time after the evening meal. I told myself this as a man who has already decided he will not do the thing he is telling himself he will do. I did not speak to the lieutenant after the evening meal. Matveyev and Shevchuk came to me after the lieutenant had settled in his designated corner of the barn, with his papers and his lamp. They came together, which told me they had already discussed it with each other. Shevchuk said they were going to leave, not in the morning with the detail. That night. He said he and Matveyev were going to take their personal gear and one of the lighter supply sleds and head south on the tributary road. He said they would take their chances with the cold and the distance because they were not willing to spend another night in Ustyalov. He said this without apology and without shame, as a statement of fact. I said they would be subject to desertion charges. Shevchuk said he understood that. I looked at Matveyev. He was 19. He looked like a man who has already made his peace with a bad choice and is waiting for the conversation to be done so he can get moving. I told them to take extra rations from the general supply and to stay on the road. I told them, if they reached the way station at the 40-kilometer mark, to wait there and send word. Then I watched them go. I did not report their departure to Lieutenant Polubin that night. I am reporting it now, to this board, for the first time in an official capacity. The board may note the additional offense this constitutes, beyond those already documented. Borodin, Kalnin, and I held the watch rotation for the final night. The lieutenant slept. We did not. I had the second watch, from roughly midnight to 2 in the morning. I want to describe what happened during my watch carefully, because it is the central event of this account, and the central reason this inquest was called. The smell came at approximately midnight. It came from the north side of the barn, between the barn and the headman's house. the narrow lane of packed snow that separated the two structures. It came as it had the previous intense night, heavy and close, the sweetness so thick in the cold air that it had a physical weight, the copper underneath it sharp enough to make the eyes water. The horses registered it simultaneously, the same pulling at the lines, the same short cry from the lead horse, that sound that I still hear when I am trying to sleep. I was at the barn door. Kalnin came to stand beside me, which meant he had been awake despite being off watch, which I had already suspected. He had his rifle. He held it in the manner of a man who already knows it is not going to be sufficient, and is holding it anyway, because it is the only tool available. I looked out through the door gap. The night was clear and bright. The lane between the barn and the headman's house was perhaps 4 meters wide. I could see the full length of it clearly. The thing was at the far end of the lane. I have tried, in the weeks since, to write a description of it that is accurate and that will be believed. I will give the board what I observed, and resist the temptation to frame it as anything other than a direct account. It was a figure of human height, perhaps slightly taller, standing at the far end of the lane, in the shadow of the headman's eave, but not entirely in shadow, because the moonlight reached far enough along the wall to illuminate part of it. The proportions were human. The posture was human, upright, still, facing the barn. The face I cannot describe with precision, because the shadow was heavier there, and because I looked at it only briefly. I looked at it for perhaps 4 seconds, and then I looked away, not from fear alone, though fear was present, but from a sensation I can only describe as the understanding that looking at it for longer was inadvisable. Not a reasoned understanding, a physical one, like the reflex that pulls your hand from heat before you have consciously registered burning. What I can describe accurately is that it did not move during the time I was looking. It stood at the end of the lane with a stillness that was not the stillness of something that has not noticed you. It was the stillness of something that is looking at you and has decided to let you know that it is looking. And then there was the granary. The granary was a separate structure, smaller than the communal barn, positioned about 20 meters east of the barn proper, on the other side of the main track. We had inspected it during the requisition count. It stored the village's grain surplus for spring planting, padlocked with a heavy iron lock. The lieutenant used it as his personal quarters, slightly removed from the men, which was a habit he had maintained throughout the posting. He had his kit in there, a lamp, his papers, a folding field cot he brought on all postings. He had gone to sleep there, as he did every night of the posting, around 9 in the evening. I want to record the sequence of the next events precisely, because the sequence is the part that this inquest has found most difficult, and the part I need to account for most carefully. At approximately midnight, the thing was at the end of the lane, stationary, as I have described. At approximately 20 minutes to 1, it was no longer at the end of the lane. It had not moved while I was watching the lane. It was simply no longer there. The smell remained, strong and constant and close. At some time between 20 minutes to 1 and 5 minutes to 1, I heard the sound from the direction of the granary. I want to be careful about what I say I heard, because I cannot be certain of it in the cold and through thick walls and from a distance of 20 meters. I believe I heard the sound of someone moving within the granary, a slow, low sound of movement, not violent, not struggle. Not the sound of a man fighting. It lasted for perhaps 2 minutes. Kalnin heard it too. He looked at me. He said nothing. Then the smell peaked. It was the strongest I had experienced in the entire posting, a physical saturation of the air that made both of us take involuntary steps backward from the door. The horses went silent, which was in some ways more alarming than their previous noise, that sudden drop into absolute stillness. For approximately 90 seconds, the smell was at that level, and then it began to drop. Not fade, drop. Quickly, like a sound cutoff, falling from overwhelming to background in under 3 minutes. At 1:10 in the morning, Kalnin said, quietly, "The granary." I looked at him. He was holding the rifle the same way, the holding it anyway grip. He was looking at me with an expression I had not seen on his face in 22 months of service, which was the expression of a man who is afraid and is being precise about it. I am going to report accurately what I did next, because it is the decision this inquest exists to examine. I barred the barn door. I drew the interior bar across the door, and I told Kalnin to check the secondary entrance at the rear of the barn. He looked at me for a moment without moving. Then he went and checked it. It was already barred. He came back and stood with me in the center of the barn, the horses quiet around us, the smell dropping by the minute, and we did not go to the granary. I did not go to the granary. I did not order anyone to go to the granary. I want to be direct with this board about the reasoning I applied in that moment, because the reasoning is the thing I have been examining every day since the 17th of January, when I walked back into the Tobolsk garrison and sat down and wrote the first version of this account. At the time, I told myself that the sound I had heard was not conclusive evidence of the lieutenant's distress, that I could not identify the source of the smell, that opening the barn door and crossing 20 meters of open ground toward a structure that was the apparent source of whatever was happening was a decision that could kill 2 more men and accomplish nothing. I told myself that the smart military decision, the decision that preserved the maximum number of remaining personnel, was to maintain position. All of this was true. All of it was also insufficient, and I have known it was insufficient since the moment I drew the bar across the door. A man can reason himself into a bad thing with good logic, and the logic being good does not change what the thing is. I do not know whether going to the granary would have saved the lieutenant's life. I am not certain he was alive at the time I drew the bar, but I did not know he was dead either, and I barred the door, and he is dead, and I carry that. At approximately 2 in the morning, the smell was back to its baseline, the faint trace level we had lived with since arrival. The horses were quiet. Borodin came on watch, and Kalnin and I sat together in the hay, without speaking for the remainder of the night. We did not sleep. Borodin stood at the door and asked us no questions, which was a kind of tact I was grateful for then and am grateful for now. At first light, I unbarred the door and crossed to the granary. The padlock was intact. That is the first thing I want to note, because it seems impossible, and the board should have it. The padlock was intact and in its hasp, locked as the lieutenant had left it the previous evening. The door showed no forcing. The walls were undamaged. I tried the padlock myself before I had Borodin shoot it open, and it was secured. The lieutenant was inside. He was on the floor beside his cot, face upward, his lamp unbroken and cold beside him. He was in full winter dress, including his overcoat, which he had evidently put on at some point during the night, which suggests he had been awake and moving after he retired, though I cannot say when. His papers were on the cot, and they were in good order. Everything in the space was in good order. He had 2 wounds at the throat, close together, clean entry, roughly 4 millimeters in diameter, spaced approximately 3 centimeters apart. His blood had settled entirely to the lowest surface of the body. The skin at the punctures was warm. I stood in the granary doorway for what I believe was a very long time, not moving, looking at him. Kalnin came up behind me and stood. Borodin remained outside. I heard Kalnin exhale once, slowly, the breath of a man releasing something he has been holding for days. Then he said, "What do we do?" I said, "We go to the sled." I went to the requisition sled. I took out the canvas sheet. I unwrapped the oilcloth. I took the iron icon and carried it across the track to the headman's house. The smell came off it the entire way, close and thick, the full copper-sweet weight of it, and I understood that the smell was not coming from the village, and had not been coming from the village. The smell traveled with this object. Whatever the icon was a seal of, the seal had been broken when we took it from the ground, and the breach in the seal was present in the object itself. I knocked on the headman's door. There was a long pause, and then Lavrov opened it. He looked at me, then at the icon in my hands. He looked at my face. I do not know what my face showed him. He stepped back from the doorway without saying anything. I went inside. I crossed to the threshold. The hole where the icon had been buried was still open, the earth frozen and crumbled around its edges, from Shevchuk's and Matveyev's extraction. I knelt and placed the icon back in the hole. I pressed it down with both hands until it was at the level of the original burial, approximately 15 centimeters below the threshold surface. I stood up. The smell, which had been heavy around the object the entire time I was carrying it, dropped off within approximately a minute of the replacement. Not gradually, not slowly. It dropped. By the time I was outside the headman's house again, it was the background trace level. By the time I was halfway to the barn, it was gone entirely. I have not smelled it since we crossed the Yenisei tributary on our return journey. I went back to the granary. Kalnin had wrapped the lieutenant in his overcoat. He had composed the body with care, the arms folded, the eyes closed, the field cot straightened and the papers stacked. We carried the lieutenant to the sled and secured him for transport. I crossed the icon off the requisition log, marking it as returned to source. I have that form here, if the board wishes to examine the alteration. We assembled the detail, Kalnin, Borodin, and myself, 3 men from a 6-man detail. We loaded the sleds, including the requisitioned goods that the village had prepared, and that the village, to its credit, had never rescinded, despite everything that had happened. We left Ustyalov at approximately 9 in the morning on the 12th of January, 6 days ahead of the original schedule. Lavrov stood at his threshold as we departed. He watched us go. He did not speak, and I did not speak to him. There is nothing either of us needed to say. He had told us what we needed to know. We had not listened, and the price of our not listening was paid by his people and by ours in roughly equal measure. Shevchuk and Matveyev were at the way station at the 40-kilometer mark, as I had told them to go. They had arrived the previous night and had been huddled there since. They were cold and frightened, and Matveyev had wept when he saw us, the weeping of profound relief, and I did not mark it against him or acknowledge it directly, which seemed to be what was needed. Shevchuk asked about the lieutenant. I said he was dead. Shevchuk asked how. I told him exposure and cardiac failure, which is what I put in the official report and what the army chose to accept, and which may be more accurate than it sounds, depending on how you define cardiac failure and what you are willing to accept as its cause. The return journey took 11 days due to weather. We entered Tobolsk garrison on the 23rd of January, 1 day past our scheduled return. The requisitioned goods were delivered to the depot. The lieutenant's body was delivered to the regimental medical officer. The official incident report, which I filed on the 24th, attributed the lieutenant's death to exposure-related cardiac event, consistent with the medical officer's examination, which found no visible injury of note to the throat, because by the time the medical officer examined the body, the wounds, which I had observed clearly in the granary at first light on the 12th, were, and I am reporting this for the first time to any official body, barely visible. They had faded in transit. The medical officer found 2 small marks that he described as minor contusions of unclear origin, insufficient to explain death, and attributed cause of death to the cardiac explanation I had supplied. I did not correct him. I did not correct him because I did not know what correction to offer that would have been believed, and because I had already decided, by that point, that getting the accurate account into a record that would be preserved was more important than having the accurate account be believed by the garrison surgeon. The requisition ledger is that record. The marginal annotations are that record. This testimony is that record. I want to account for several remaining items before I conclude. The requisition ledger and its annotations. Kalnin wrote the first entries, cataloging the death count and the wound characteristics. I wrote the subsequent entries, including the record of the icon, the account of Lavrov's warning, the detail of Tarasova's findings regarding skin temperature, the geographical progression of deaths, and finally, in the last margin of the last requisition page, after the icon entry was crossed off, a note regarding the smell. Specifically that the smell did not leave us until we crossed the river, that two of the men, and here I meant Kalnin and Borodin rather than naming them, never stopped looking behind them. That is the final annotation. I wrote it on the night of the 23rd of January, after returning to garrison, before filing the official report. The icon. I returned it to the threshold on the morning of the 12th. I have no knowledge of its current condition, or the current condition of the settlement of Ustyalov. This inquest does not, to my knowledge, have plans to dispatch another detail to the settlement, and I would recommend against it unless that detail is briefed on the specific conditions in the village and has orders that do not require the removal of any object from the headman's threshold, under any circumstances, for any reason. The survival of the detail. 3 men came home from 6. The lieutenant is dead. Shevchuk and Matveyev deserted, returned, and are subject to whatever this board determines regarding that offense. And I note that my decision to allow their departure without reporting it makes me complicit in that desertion. Kalnin and Borodin are serviceable but altered. I speak from direct observation when I say that Kalnin, who was the steadiest man in the detail prior to this posting, has not slept a full night since we returned, and that Borodin has developed a habit of checking doors and windows after dark that he had not had before. I do not raise this to generate sympathy for them. I raise it because the inquest's assessment of this event should include the condition of the men who returned, not only the men who did not. The matter of my own conduct. I have identified in this testimony 3 specific failures that are mine, and that I will not diminish. I failed to report my initial observations about the village tracks to Lieutenant Polubin when we arrived. I failed to tell him about Tarasova's statement when she made it. I did not take the icon from the sled and return it when I had the opportunity and the physical means to do so, and I barred the barn door rather than going to the granary. Of these, the last is the one I hold most heavily, and I hold it every day, and I will hold it until this account is complete, and possibly considerably longer. The board should note, for the record, that I am aware of what I did and what I did not do, and I am not asking for any particular consideration on that basis. I am giving a complete account, because a complete account is the only honest thing I have to offer at this stage. I have one final observation to make before I am done. The agreement that Lavrov's grandfather made with what was in that river valley was not, as I originally understood it, a desperate and irrational concession to superstition. It was a working solution to an impossible situation that had preserved the lives of that settlement for approximately 3 generations. It was a kind of logic that I would not have recognized as logic before this posting, and that I recognize now with a clarity that is, I will admit, somewhat uncomfortable to carry. The argument that educated men in modern institutions do not make agreements with things that should not exist because things that should not exist do not exist is not an argument that survived my experience in Ustyalov in January of 1915. I do not know what is in the Yenisei Valley. I do not know what the icon means to it, or why the arrangement holds. I know that when the arrangement held, 11 people died over 11 days, and I know that when the arrangement was broken, 5 people died in 4 days, and one of them was mine to lose. The arrangement was not irrational. It was the most rational thing in that settlement, and we broke it out of paperwork. That is the complete account I have to give this board. I have answered the questions put to me. I have reported everything I observed, and everything I failed to do. The ledger is in evidence. I have nothing more to add. Corporal Dmitry Alexeyevich Vashenko, 2nd Company, 14th Siberian Rifle Regiment, Tobolsk, 14th of February 1915, signed under oath. The ledger remains in the regimental archive, so far as I know. The requisition form, with the icon crossed off and marked returned, is still appended to it. I have asked, through informal means, whether Ustyalov has reported any further incidents to the district since our departure. The reply I received was that the village has had no unusual mortality since January, that the population is stable, and that the headman submitted the spring planting record without irregularity in March of this year. That is the information I was able to obtain. It means, I think, what it means. There is one thing more I want to say that is outside the formal account. This board did not ask for it, but I am going to give it because the record should contain it. Lieutenant Polubin was a man doing his job. He was not cruel. He was not foolish in the ordinary sense, and he was not dismissive out of contempt. He was dismissive because he had built a complete and ordered picture of the world, and he saw no reason to revise it, and nothing in his experience had ever given him reason to revise it before Ustyalov. I understand his reasoning. I shared his reasoning, up to and including the moment when I could not. The difference between us was not intelligence or character. The difference was that I survived long enough to be proven wrong, and he did not. I do not know what to do with that difference, except to report it accurately, and to carry it, as I said, for however long I have left to carry things. I did not go to the granary. I will not make a case that I was right not to. I will only say that I did not go, and that he was inside, and that the door was locked from the outside when we opened it, and that I have spent the 42 days since doing the arithmetic on that locked door every time I am awake in the hours between midnight and 3, which is often, which is every night. That is all.